Chapter 5 will focus on the impact gender has on development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. Video 1 will go over some important definitions and then focus on the traditional approach to gender, historically speaking. Video 2 will then look at how gender socialization has changed in more recent history. To start, as I mentioned, there's a few important definitions we need to know. The first one is the difference between biological sex and gender. When I say gender, I do not mean an individual's biological sex. Biological sex just refers to a specific chromosome that each individual has, or our physiological biological status as being male or female. Again, this is determined by chromosomes. Females have two X chromosomes, males have an X and a Y chromosome. There are some outcomes of an individual's sex that we need to keep in mind. For example, we know that females experience greater increases in estrogen during puberty, as we talked about during biological development, while biological males experience greater levels of testosterone. So, although we're going to focus more on gender during this lecture, it is important to remember that an individual's biological sex does impact their development, especially when it comes to hormones and physiological aspects of an individual's life. But when it comes to an individual's psychology, and specifically their development, gender often plays a more prominent role. Gender is a social construct, something we as a society have created, a category for being a man and being a woman. These genders are established by the social norms and expectations that we have for someone. Oftentimes, those categories go hand in hand with an individual's biological sex, but of course, that is not always the case. So an example of an outcome of gender could look like this. Men are less likely to report symptoms of mental illness. That's not necessarily a biological aspect of gender. There's not necessarily and likely isn't a biological aspect of being male that makes men less likely to report mental illness. Rather, it's more so the case that the social construct of gender has made it less acceptable for men to seek help. So, an outcome of that, less attention to mental illness for men. So hopefully you can see here how biological sex and gender impact us in a very different way, regardless of whether an individual's gender and biological sex match. And the next term we want to look at is gender socialization. So again, gender is a category that society has created, a list of norms, things we expect someone to do, to look like, to be interested in, ways we expect them to behave based off of the category they fall into. And we develop these expectations through the process of gender socialization, where the culture teaches us while we're developing how we should expect certain genders to play out. One example of gender socialization is television shows marketed at, in this case, teenage girls and teenage boys. If you're familiar with shows like Gossip Girl, shows like Family Guy, you'll notice while you're watching them that they teach us different things about gender. They teach us how a girl should look, how boys should act. All of these different aspects of gender come from, in part, the media we consume, but they also come from every aspect of our society. So while we're being raised in a certain culture, many aspects of that culture are teaching us how to be a boy, how to be a girl, and what it looks like when we don't necessarily fall neatly into one of those categories. So the next thing I want to look at are traditional cultures, because we know, one, that traditional cultures that still exist today have very different gender norms, and two, many non-traditional cultures still have aspects of their social development that trace back to these traditional expectations. So you'll notice while I'm going through traditional cultures today that a lot of what I'm talking about might sound familiar to your own culture. So let's start by looking at the traditional gender expectations for girls. We know that girls in traditional cultures have closer relationships with their mother. That is, in fact, the most important relationship for a girl from childhood through adolescence. The young girl will be heavily involved in housework and childcare when they have younger siblings and kind of work underneath the mom as the mom teaches them how to hold those different roles. When we move into adolescence in traditional cultures, teenage girls tend to adopt a large proportion of the workload in the house. And in fact, sometimes we see them carrying the same amount of workload as the mother while maintaining that close relationship. However, even though this individual is taking on more and more responsibilities throughout adolescence, and even though that relationship with the mother remains close, we actually see socialization narrow once a girl reaches puberty, where she is more and more isolated from individuals outside of the family. You'll see increased supervision, very restrictive control over experience and expression of sexuality, and oftentimes adolescent girls will be removed from schooling. So you see their social world narrow, in addition to the way they're being socialized to behave, in an attempt to maintain those traditional purity values and prepare the girl for marriage, and then eventually motherhood. Boys, on the other hand, have very different experiences during adolescence and emerging adulthood. The goal here is oftentimes to achieve the status of manhood. Unlike girls, who have to reach their first period in order to be considered a woman, boys oftentimes have to prove through various ways that they are a man. And that can take over a very large portion of a boy's experience during their adolescent years. It can be a very stressful time, especially when the individual doesn't meet the expectations of that society. And when that happens, they can develop the reputation of being a failed man. You'll actually notice if you look at different traditional cultures, such as traditional Mexican culture and some traditional cultures in the African continent, each of these cultures has a term, and in fact, as I mentioned, there's parallels here. We have them in our own cultures in America to denote someone as being a failed man. I'm not going to share what those words are because they are often derogatory, but they are words that we use to describe a man who isn't behaving manly. And these often start to be used during adolescence. Part of the socialization process is taking an adolescent and kind of forcing them to spend less and less time at home and less time with their mothers. So instead, they receive much more socialization from their peers, where they're spending the bulk of their time around other boys their age or young men who are, the goal, of course, teaching them how to achieve manhood. In fact, we often see adolescent boys teased and mocked or be given that title of failed man for preferring to spend time in the company of females. Even their mother, sister, aunts, anything like that can be a source of extreme social downgrading for them. So what does it mean to be a successful man, if that's the goal here? Across culture, there tends to be three defining aspects of an individual that help them achieve the status of manhood. Those three variables are the ability to provide, the ability to protect, and the ability to procreate. So oftentimes during the adolescent years, young teenage boys are striving to show, to illustrate that they can provide, that they can protect, and that they can procreate. So what you often see happening is exhibitions of these three different skills in order to achieve that status. So I want you to think about this for a second. Some characteristics of a successful man in traditional cultures: being diligent, having stamina, exhibiting the ability to engage in warfare, use of weapons, exhibiting courage, fortitude, and confidence, as well as boldness, are all parts or traits that we associate with the ability to provide, protect, and procreate. So in traditional cultures, you'll see traditions, you'll see exhibitions, you'll see rites of passage where adolescent boys express all of these various characteristics. But they tend to go along pretty well with gender norms in non-traditional cultures. Things that make an individual manly, even in our own culture in America. But that being said, most gender socialization that happens in traditional culture during the adolescent years focuses on developing these characteristics when they're not as enforced in non-traditional cultures today. The next thing I want to look at is the history of gender norms and gender socialization in the Americas specifically in the USA for girls and boys. We know that historically speaking, meaning during the 17th and 1800s, middle-class girls were very restricted. They didn't have career options. They were expected to stay at home. They were seen as very fragile and innocent, something to admire, to protect, to show off, but to keep isolated and safe. A big part of that, of course, was closely monitored virginity. This was the case actually up until the 1920s, where a middle-class girl was protected as much as possible, sometimes not even told about the menstrual cycle or about periods until they experienced it for the first time. This was seen as an additional way to protect their innocence. Don't give them information. They won't need to know anything until it's absolutely necessary. So this is an extremely sheltered approach to socialization. And then, of course, there were also strict expectations for physical appearance, thinness, complexion, dress, hairstyle. All of that goes along with the way middle-class girls were socialized. Non-middle-class girls, or women from lower-class families, lower-class communities in the U.S. during the first 200 or so years of our country's history, were actually treated very similarly to traditional adolescent girls. Very close relationships with the mother, carrying a big portion of the workload at home, kept apart from adolescents of the other gender, and so on and so forth. But starting in the 19th century, they actually moved into the workforce. So instead of being sheltered, narrowly socialized, starting in the 1900s, they experienced much more broad socialization because they began to interact with other people outside of their household. The history for boys, specifically adolescent boys, is a little bit different. We've seen 3 different approaches to gender socialization for males in our country. The first one was the idea of communal manhood, where in the 17th and 18th century, adolescent boys were socialized to assume male roles in the household, to provide, and to be a good spouse. So you didn't really see a big drive for individualism yet. This was a very collectivist approach to teaching gender norms. They were expected to provide and protect and then, of course, procreate. And that was the goal. That was what they were taught during the 17th and 18th centuries. During the early part of the 19th century, we shifted from communal manhood to the idea of the self-made man. Self-made manhood takes what was a very collectivist approach to socialization and enforces more individualism, where men were expected to exhibit self-control and willpower in order to become independent of their family. So these are very different. For the first 2 centuries of our country's history, men were very communally socialized, very collectivist. And then, during the Industrial Revolution and all of the changes that took place after, we started to see the rise of this individualistic approach to manhood. After that, nowadays, we see something called passionate manhood, where adolescent boys are taught self-expression and self-enjoyment as being the optimum expression of manhood. That as well looks very different from even self-made manhood a short while ago. That brings me to the end of video 1. Video 2 will pick up by looking at modern gender socialization.